You're watching Sat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi, and joining us is Dr. Ayesha Ray. She's an associate professor at King's College, Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Ray.
Thank you.
Just wanted to get your reading of what's happened since the meeting on the sidelines of the SCO in Moscow between Wang Yi and Dr. Jaishankar, and that joint statement that was issued, a 5-point agreement, so as to speak. There were a couple of other notes that were issued by both sides as well that seem to indicate some differences as well. But it's clear that even though there are those 5 points, that we're nowhere near any kind of settlement, especially looking at the situation on the ground when heavily armed troops, and be hearing even heavy arms, tanks, missiles, etc., just 300, 400 meters from each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Amitabh. So I think the 5-point consensus is a good step moving forward, given the fact that the last 5-6 months have been pretty dismal in terms of the relationship. Yet the 5-point consensus really doesn't lay out the specifics of what this agreement is going to be. And so it says that disengagement is vital. Now, we have been hearing about this disengagement. We've been hearing words like de-escalation and consensus for the last 6 months. But as you know, in the last 6 months, the mobilization of troops on both sides has just increased. And it seems like there's a contradiction in what's happening on the ground and what's happening through diplomatic channels. And I think the key here is to maintain the consistent language going forward, just to make sure that India's intent is very clear to China. China has made its intent pretty clear. I don't think China is going to back down, right? You see these questioning statements, even in the consensus. You see China kind of pushing India a little bit, saying that, well, maybe, we kind of know what we're doing, but you need to get your act together. And I think it's important for India not to fall for this sort of, I would say, tacit manipulation on part of China. And so again, I think India needs to make its intent clear. And now, of course, strategy is always complicated, right? You don't want to give your adversary all the tips. On that you have, but you still want to be able to maintain, have a coherent message. And I think the last 6 months, what's been the downside for Indian policy has been kind of the contradictory messages, sometimes from the Ministry of External Affairs, sometimes from leaders in government, including our Prime Minister. And I think all of those things have muddied the waters, and definitely reduces India's bargaining leverage. And so the idea here is that India needs to maintain its leverage. If these recent positions that Indian forces claimed or took, right, are important from the position from the perspective of Indian military strategy, then India needs to maintain that leverage, right?
Sure. So you clearly see the latest developments south of the Pangang, so as a leverage for bargaining in talks. So we've done that before in 2014. When a similar incident took place, it'd gone maybe 500 kilometers away from that particular incident, and then there was a quid pro quo.
Right. But this has been a more prolonged sort of engagement, right? I think, it's going over months, and there have been conflicting statements. And what I'm kind of skeptical about, again, is the language. So I think we keep seeing the effort to talk, right? But you've had these talks at the defense ministry level. You've had like at the foreign ministry level now, as we've had I think talks at the brigade commander level, the corps commander level. So all of these talks, what's the culmination? Not much, because we still don't know the specifics. Is China actually telling India to push back? Is China actually telling India to go and go move back from the position that it's claimed? Is India, really wanting China to again go back to the status quo ante that we had in April or May? And so these questions still remain unanswered. And I think as long as we don't know the specifics, we're still in a gray area. And if you're in a gray area, there's room for misperception. There's room for all kinds of errors to kind of happen.
So when you're seeing the latest statement, you're mentioning status quo ante pre-April. There's no mention of that. No, they're
Right.
talking
And I
about
think
those
that's
five.
really problematic because that's where it begins, right?
Yeah.
And so if China is reluctant to go back to the status quo ante, then that leaves India with very few options. And the military one is a very real option then.
When you talk about not consistent statements coming from the leadership, then there's the army statements as well that have been coming out now and then. But do you see a change in mindset in the Indian positioning, at least vis-a-vis China, for example, in what's happened in the latest situation in Ladakh?
Again, Amitabh, I mean, to be honest, it would be hard to tell given the fact that in the last few months we've actually seen these contradictory positions. So we would need, I think, more specific, clear proposals. Like, what exactly does India want China to do, right? And just merely saying that we're disengaging or we're going to maintain the tranquility and peace that we had established according to the border agreements is not enough. I mean, what does that mean, right? Does that mean that has China agreed to the status quo ante in April? No, that's not what China has agreed upon, right? And so we need to get those answers from China, I think, in some way. And unless we get those answers, we're still going to be stuck in the situation where, maybe 15, 20 days down the line, you see another sort of confrontation happening, a possible skirmish happening, so
But
I think we need more clarity.
The Indian position, at least in moving the Chinese to agreeing in some manner over a process
Right,
to
and that is the
restore.
leverage. That is
Yeah.
leveraging for sure. Absolutely. And then I think it's an interesting step. The only question again is why did India or the political leadership decided that this was the right time for the military to take this step, and why not in June when we lost our soldiers and we had. I think the stakes were very high that time, and so why now? And so that's a question that I'm left wondering about.
Well, then again, like you're saying, we don't know the specifics on the ground, what the real situation is. But like you're saying, even if there is some kind of agreement, disengagement, de-escalation, moving back, and that anyway, it seems like it's going to be a process that takes time because when you're talking about those 5 points that were raised there, it's not just leaving it to the field commanders or the military commanders on the ground. They're talking about the special representatives who talk, 22 times already?
Yes.
The working mechanism as well. So it's already winter. I mean, at least on those heights,
Right.
the
And
temperatures
it
would
becomes
already be.
harder. And those are very challenging, demanding, brutal, environments to work in. So
Sure. So would you see like the Chinese actually looking at what's happening in the US, the presidential elections, and prolonging this into winter
yeah,
and possibly later?
that's a very good question, Amitabh, actually, that you're raising, because it's possible that they just want to drag this out, and they want to drag this out. And so we might see moments where there's a little bit of dialogue happening, some talks, but nothing concrete coming out. But China is not going to back down, right? I mean, if you look at even the last few movements of Chinese forces, I mean, they've just been building forces,
Yep.
building infrastructure on all these sensitive positions along the line of actual control. I mean, there's been no intent from the Chinese side to actually pull its forces back, right? And so only once they show signs like that is it possible. So, for instance, even in June or July, I think, I had read reports where they were building a helipad at. And so I was rather alarmed when I saw that, and I was like, well, this is a sign where China is probably entrenching itself, right? We see all these mobilizations of its military and armaments and all of that. And so until and unless there are signs where it's scaling back, there's no reason to trust their messaging. And I'm sure they're thinking the same thing about India as well. And so this is a game of yeah, I hope it doesn't become a cat and mouse game where we're waiting way too long.
Sure.
And just having more incidents like this, unfortunately.
The Indian side, of course, saying it is prepared if it is necessary to stay there for the long haul. Whether it's winter, they are more accustomed to the area, the terrain, the temperature, in terms of military capabilities, at least in terms of troop levels. But how do you see? If China has been taken by surprise, first, do you think that China has been taken by surprise by the latest on the ground moves?
I think to some extent, yes.
And
And
if that
maybe
is
that was,
so, would
Mhm.
you then expect a response?
Yeah, and that's a very good question again. So this could go two ways. I mean, you have this 5 point consensus. China waits a little while, but then China is going to take a step, right? And it's going to retaliate. Now we don't know what form it's going to retaliate in. It could be in Pangongso, but it could pick another different sector, right?
Completely, yeah.
So the only scenarios are if it's going to take a retaliatory step, it's going to be either immediate or we're going to see it also pull a surprise on India, which could be, in a month from now or 2 months from now. And so maybe they're going to wait it out and try and develop a strategy where they take India by surprise too. So I feel like now that India has actually, these positions were occupied, and India took a kind of a tactical offensive. It's imperative for Indian forces and India's political leadership not to fall asleep on the table. To be actually very careful, because this could be the time that we actually see a sudden change or a sudden response that we were not expecting. And just because there's a 5 point consensus or an agreement, that really doesn't mean that the ground situation has changed. And so I think that's what the focus and the eyes should be on right
Dr. Ray,
now.
to that extent, would you say the Indian political, diplomatic, military mindset has changed in terms of what's been happening over the last 30, 40 years, in whether you want to call it engagement with China, appeasement of China, uh, the, and the notes that the Chinese have issued also indicate
Mhm.
something that the Indians are very unhappy with, that there's a delinking or decoupling of the border dispute, what's happening on the ground, and bilateral relations. You think India has finally woken up to the fact that you can't trust China? And if you do, where does that take us back to? As in pre 1988, even pre 1976, in terms of the structure of how we're dealing with China?
Right. I think India militarily has, of course, come forward, right, from 62 and 75. It's not the same situation. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, we are not at the same level of China. I mean, I have to be very frank about this.
yeah,
Militarily, China is always going to hold a conventional edge over India. And then, of course, we both have nuclear
sure.
weapons. I mean, although I don't think that the nuclear factor is going to be played into very quickly, I think the countries are rational enough to understand the costs that are attached to nuclear weapons. But conventional military strength of China, right, is very, very strong. The also reading reports about cybersecurity and all of this stuff, where they have other ways of undermining India. And so I think even though their capability is stronger, I mean, I think India can maintain its defenses, and India has come a long way since 62 and 75. The only thing is that I think we would have to build on things like our Mountain Strike Corps, which what is it functional? I mean, we need to work on the things we've already established and created, our theater commands, all of that, and try to kind of integrate it into some semblance of a strategy that can be implemented on the ground. So the pieces are there,
Mhm.
I think, but India would, I mean, militarily, we would have to work it out and work it out fast.
Interesting that you brought up the nuclear issue, because I haven't seen, for one, any discussion, whether it's
Right.
in print
And
or in media, in total stark contrast to what happens when it's with Pakistan.
I know, and again, this is interesting that India or I don't know if it's the current dispensation takes a very different approach, right? When it comes to Pakistan, it's much more muscular, but with China, we haven't seen that kind of sort of forceful positioning, except for maybe now, that we're seeing some changes on the ground.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's intriguing to say the least. I mean, China is a much more powerful country. Perhaps China is a greater adversary than Pakistan. Of course, there's always the China-Pakistan connection, right? So I think India needs to really think about who it, I mean, what its aims are, right? I mean, what its security aims are in the South Asian context. How does it want to play Pakistan on one hand? How does it want to play China? If it's going to play China a certain way, it has to take into calculations if that step is going to include Pakistan. But all these steps have to be thought out very carefully. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. I don't know if they're two completely divergent methods that they want to apply, but so far, yeah, they've taken a very, very different approach with Pakistan, right? I mean, there's a lot more jingoism, a lot more extreme nationalism when it comes to Pakistan, and uh, there's less of that, considering that this is a fairly nationalist government that we have in power, right? I mean, with China, they've been tempered, right? So.
Dr. Ayesha Ray, absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks for all your insights.
Thank you so much, Amitabh. Take care. Thank you for having me.
And a reminder to our viewers, you can get all the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective on our website, and do support our kind of journalism on Strat News. You've been watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Ravi.